Well, thank you, Bruce, very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And there will be Hayek beyond the title as well. It's coming, so buckle up. But it's a pleasure and honor to be here amongst friends and people I admire. And so thank you all very much for taking the time to come. And I'm gonna cover a lot of ground here in a 40 to 50 minute time period, both in terms of the breadth of topics, but also the number of thinkers I draw upon and try to weave together in the name of hopefully being provocative, but not just for the sake of being provocative, but because these are big topics and they're hard topics. And in many cases, I won't be providing any kind of clear answers to the challenges I pose. But if the takeaway is that you reflect upon these things, which are certainly relevant both historically but also in contemporary times with everything going on in the world, I will feel like I have done my job. And so let's start from the kind of foundations of this, which is the U.S. has been described as a liberal empire. And with that, the government's imperial strategy is described as liberal hegemony. In this respect, the U.S. government is tasked with using its global power to exert influence over others while promoting Western values. The centerpiece of the U.S. liberal empire is the U.S. military and its power to overwhelm political opponents and also to shape the world according to the wishes of U.S. policymakers, the U.S. national security elite. Now, at the heart of any empire is an ideology of imperialism. And imperialism is a belief system, but also a set of policies by which one nation's government projects its economic, political, and social power and control over people who reside in other societies. Imperialism entails a commitment both to hard military power, complemented by soft diplomatic power. Now, the argument for an imperial American foreign policy is usually grounded in a Hobbesian view of the world. In this view, there is a natural aggression between nations, and that natural aggression needs to be constrained and controlled, typically by some central global power. The underlying assumption that underpins this is that a liberal international order will not emerge spontaneously, but it requires imperial design, and that imperial design needs to be backstopped by military force. Of course, in the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. has been the regional hegemon since the 19th century, and since the 1940s, the U.S. government has been the global hegemon. Now, in response to the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, with the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict, with perceived threats from China, from North Korea, and many others around the world, we are told, there are ongoing calls for both the U.S. government to reassert its global dominance and expand that dominance. And to my reading, many of these treatments of these calls for expansion are one-sided. They focus on the potential public goods of empire while neglecting the potential bads and their sources. And so part of what I hope to accomplish today in our short time together is to remedy this by talking about the flip side, some of the bads of empire that we should take into account when we are thinking about these issues. So to begin, let me begin with the intellectual foundations of empire, which is typically located in the logic of public goods. Now, in the 1930s, the economist Richard Musgrave laid the groundwork for contemporary public goods theory. Paul Samuelson, who's pictured here, formalized that theory in the 1950s. And of course, according to Musgrave and Samuelson, goods that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous will fail to be supplied in efficient quantities and qualities by private people who are left to their own devices. In Samuelson's words, the possibility of a decentralized, spontaneous solution to the provision of public goods is impossible. Samuelson also provided national defense as an example of a public good. And of course, anyone who's taking principles of economics knows that national defense is the textbook example of a public good. And to this day, Beyond national defense, the Samuelsonian vision or model of public goods has a vice grip on how social scientists view national defense, but also the enormous scope of state powers that fall under the purview of national defense. Those all fall under this general category of public good. Now, some, including some of the liberal persuasion, have extended this logic to the international space. And in doing so, they have called for the provision of global public goods. And it's not hard to see why. If you buy the Samuelsonian logic of public goods within a nation's border, it's not a big leap to extend that same logic internationally. So from this perspective, national defense collapses into global defense, and global defense is operationalized through global empire, which serves as the global provider of public goods. One example of this type of reasoning is the 2004 book In Praise of Empires by the economist Deepak Lal. Lal argues that liberal empire is necessary to bring about liberal international order, based on the logic of public goods as I just outlined. Now, what I want to argue, among other things, is that social scientists have made a serious error in taking this approach. And the reason I believe it's a serious error is because they have drained economics from the exercise. To this way of thinking, the state provides efficient defense, peace, and order by assumption. And the state is necessary in the first place because private people fail to effectively provide the good in question, again by assumption. I also want to argue that liberals who have embraced the Musgrave-Samuelsonian logic for the premise of liberal empire have also made a serious intellectual error. The reason is that this approach overemphasizes the goods that are generated by empire while neglecting the significant bads, which include the erosion and rejection of liberal principles. There's another issue. In presenting the state as the source of domestic and international order through military might, liberals have given up the game. They've given up the game in terms of offering strong arguments against imperialism and militarism. This contributes to the persistence of the belief that imperialism and militarism are natural outgrowths of liberalism and capitalism. I came across a recent example of this in a symposium in Harper's Magazine titled Is Liberalism Worth Saving? And there were numerous participants in this symposium. Deirdre McCloskey was one of them. Another was Cornel West. And Cornel West argued in this discussion about what constitutes liberalism and whether it's worth saving, that blindness to militarism and imperialism are part of what he called, quote, the dark side of liberalism. And I think he has a point that I hope to at least begin to remedy in my discussion today. And to do so, we need to reflect upon the realities of empire and the militarism and imperialism that are natural outgrowths of it. And to do so, I want to discuss 5 challenges to the widely accepted view of the government provision of defense. And then from there, I'll move on to how we can constructively think about peace and the study of peace. So let me walk through these 5 challenges. The first is the economic calculation problem. The domestic military sector is grounded in non-comprehensive planning. The means of production are privately owned and operated, but the sector is not characterized by private competitive markets. Instead, military-related production involves significant entanglements between a massive government apparatus and private firms, with those interactions governed by bureaucratic rules and mandates. The sector, the military sector, is guided by the visions, preferences, and demands of those who control the relevant part of the managerial administrative state. Military contracting replaces the market process with a bureaucratic process, and final defense outputs are not sold on a competitive market, meaning there is no genuine market for final goods and services. So what does this mean? Well, among other things, it means that the economic knowledge that emerges through and exists in competitive markets is curtailed or outright absent. This matters in 2 ways. First, consumer valuations emerge and are communicated through the competitive market process. Defense planners don't avoid the need to discover the most economical means of production. Keep in the back of your mind that public good arguments are ultimately efficiency arguments. Also keep in mind that there is no predetermined and given production function for national and global security provision. So people have to make decisions about how to best allocate scarce resources. Second, there is no way for planners to determine if outputs are value added from an economic perspective. There's no way to gauge the opportunity cost of the scarce resources employed to produce final military-related outputs. This does not relate to simply comparing one military-related output to another, but broadly to comparing military-related outputs to all other possible uses for those scarce resources. This is important because economic resources that are used in the military sector are necessarily withdrawn from the private sector. And in that alternative context, those resources would have been subjected to the market process. Also keep in mind that the issue is not one of crowding out. It's not one of one-to-one crowding out. Instead, it's a fundamental inability of defense planners to resolve the knowledge problem because of their inability to weigh the opportunity cost of scarce resources across potential uses. Also keep in mind that the operation of the military sector has broader effects on the very nature of the economic system itself. In replacing the market process with the political process, government planners extend the organizational techniques of the military and war economy, which include top-down hierarchical command and control, regimentation, and bureaucratic mandates, to the domestic economy. This has real negative effects on the operation of private markets, which leads to the second challenge, which is the public choice challenge. The members of the military administrative state must have discretionary power to intervene to address circumstances both at home and abroad which cannot be foreseen in advance, foreseen in advance. The core aspects of the military sector, parasitic extraction from the private economy, production tied to public-private partnerships, and discretion on the part of government planners, means that the state embeds itself in economic and social life, which also means that it creates significant state for political capitalism. Of course, political capitalism refers to the institutionalization of entanglements between the private and public sector. All of the insights from public choice economics apply in spades to the military sector and empire. Private firms and interest groups engage in rampant rent-seeking. The legislative gatekeepers in the military who control the military purse possess a property right over the distribution of government funding and resources, which incentivizes rent extraction. The revolving door spins fast and furious. The bureaucratic apparatus of the U.S. military sector is so extensive and dense that its true size is unknown. Its members are unable to follow processes that meet even the most basic accounting standards, yet they're continually rewarded with bigger and bigger budgets year on year. The military empire apparatus is also characterized by information asymmetries on steroids. Due to the aforementioned bureaucratic labyrinth, but also because of overclassification of information, which is used by those who are in the military sector to strategically hide their activities in order to limit oversight and accountability. In a liberal democracy, the actions of public officials are supposed to represent and advance the interests of the members of the polity. However, the pathologies of democratic politics means there's oftentimes, if not always, a significant wedge between the actions of the political elite and those whose interests they purport to represent. To my way of thinking, there's good reason to believe that these pathologies are magnified and intensified in the context of national security and empire, given the industrial organization of the military sector, as well as the scale and scope of government needed to operate global empire. The public good justification of the state provision of defense is that suggests that there's a significant collective action problem that cannot be overcome by private actors. One issue with that way of thinking is that if private actors cannot overcome the various challenges which are involved in the provision of security, it's unclear how they can overcome the collective action problem of monitoring and disciplining the expansive and awesome powers of a Leviathan that is granted the powers to control the world and to bring belligerent actors in the world to heel. The third challenge is what I call the meta-institutional or meta-planning challenge. Proponents of empire treat the world as if it is a grand technical engineering problem that can be solved with the right amount of resources and expertise. The result is an unconstrained vision premised on the steadfast belief that the world can be controlled and designed based on superior human reason that is wielded by high IQ people. One issue with this unconstrained vision is that it overlooks the knowledge constraints or limits on human reason over the institutions of society. Appreciating the limitations has two implications. First, we cannot fully grasp the complexities of the world in our own society, let alone in societies around the globe. Second, we don't know how to go about designing a liberal society, let alone a liberal world from scratch, even under the best case scenario. Policymakers typically attempt to circumvent these circumstances by playing democracy and by playing economic development. They do so by producing a range of observable outputs: elections, ceremonies of political pomp and circumstance, and investment expenditures on grandiose projects as quickly as possible. Because foreign interventions are necessarily simplistic relative to the complex systems they seek to influence and shape, negative and perverse consequences are unavoidable. But because of the political incentives that policymakers face, there's a tendency to neglect these long-term unseen consequences and instead focus on the here and now and the visible aspects of foreign interventions. In the absence of knowledge of how to design complex systems, those who attempt to do so will have to rely on knowledge that's generated through the domestic political process. That political process, as I mentioned, is characterized by bureaucratic inertia, self-interested democratic and domestic and foreign interest groups, and significant information asymmetries, which makes it near impossible for ordinary people, both at home and abroad, to know what is happening in their name. Public choice scholars have done admirable work to catalog the large portfolio of government failures pertaining to domestic government programs. An interesting question to reflect upon is whether one should expect those same government failures to be more or less relevant and more or less severe in matters of foreign policy. If there's reason to believe these failures are relevant and likely to be more severe in foreign affairs, that's good reason for pause. If not, if there's something special and unique about empire and foreign affairs that allows those activities to transcend epistemic and incentive constraints, that too is valuable. It's valuable in demonstrating the efficacy of large-scale, top-down global government planning in economic, political, and social matters. The fourth challenge is paternalistic authoritarianism. Liberal empire requires a group of government elites to hold fast to the belief that they can control people both domestically and abroad in order to implement their global blueprint for order. Here's an interesting question. Who's going to run the thing? Who will rise to positions of power to operate the apparatus of empire? Well, let's think back to some of the economists who attempted to address these same questions in matters of planning. In the 1930s, the economist Frank Knight noted that planning authorities would have to, quote, exercise their power ruthlessly. Now, he's talking about economic planning. They would have to, quote, exercise their power ruthlessly to keep the machinery of organized production and distribution running, and that they would have to enforce orders ruthlessly and suppress all disputation and argument against policies, end quote. Where did this lead Knight? Well, it led him to conclude the following. Quote, the probability of the people in power being individuals who would dislike the possession and exercise of power is on level with the probability that an extremely tender-hearted person would get the job of whipping master on a slave plantation, end quote. F.A. Hayek went through a similar thought exercise in The Road to Serfdom. In that book, he has a chapter about why the worst may very well get on top once you implement or attempt to implement economic planning. The reason why is because planners have to have significant discretionary power. So who, Hayek asked, is likely to rise in a system and flourish in a system where you have to wield power over your fellow human beings? Hayek answered that, quote, the most unscrupulous and uninhibited are likely to be more successful, end quote. What Knight and Hayek realized was that those that feel comfortable exercising power and control over other human beings are the most likely to rise in systems where there's largely unconstrained top-down government power. Economic planning within a domestic economy is one manifestation of that. Purporting to control the entire world is another manifestation of that logic. What they argued is, irrespective of the type of person that enters the system, in order to succeed in that system, they're going to have to behave in a certain way. The incentives that are created by top-down planning will either attract people on the front end who are comfortable doing it, or it will force people to act and change as if they are comfortable doing it. Because if you're not attracted on the front end to controlling other people, you won't apply for the job in the first place. And if you get into the system that requires you to control other people and you are uncomfortable with it, you will soon be replaced. You'll wash out, and you'll be replaced by the more ambitious and able. In the context of empire and foreign affairs, what I call the interventionist mindset, which is the mindset required to run this thing, has 5 characteristics. And in order to be successful, it requires possessing some mix of these characteristics. First, extreme confidence in the ability of government interveners to solve complex problems around the world. Empire requires the belief that a small group of elites can influence and manipulate societies to fit their grand vision. Moreover, it requires the belief that this vision will be implemented in the desired manner. Think about the very idea of the concept of nation building. What is nation building? It's really an extreme sense of confidence that entire nations, which include all of the complex institutions and histories and traditions, to have a well-functioning liberal society, can be designed and implemented by a relatively small group of people who then implement that plan through a military apparatus. Second characteristic of the interventionist mindset, a sense of superiority. A sense of superiority over other human beings regarding scientific knowledge, preferences, and righteousness. Interventionists believe that their vision is superior to the status quo. If they didn't think their vision was superior to the status quo, they would have no urge to intervene in the first place. This sense of supremacy is multifaceted. It's predicated on the belief that those intervening first possess superior knowledge compared to other people, second, possess preferences that are preferable to those who are being intervened upon, and 3, possess the moral right and duty to act on their superior knowledge and preferences. What this leads to is an attitude of condemnation, a condemnation of the preferences, choices, and ways of life of other people who are viewed as inferior compared to those who wield the power of empire. Third, comfort with a use of wide range and often repugnant means to impose the plans of the interveners. Those tasked with running an empire are so confident in their vision that they oftentimes, if not always, feel quite comfortable employing a wide variety of means to achieve their ends. Some of these means are what we refer to as soft power. It's attracting and persuading other people to follow what you want them to do. But more often than not, it's hard power. It is force. It is coercion. Historically, empires have involved extreme forms of hard power. We don't have to look back that far, just since 2001 and the events that unfolded, to see the US government engaging in a variety of forms of extreme hard power, including torture, long-term incarceration without due process, killing of innocent civilians who are neatly categorized as collateral damage, among a range of other behaviors. In addition to directly adopting these ruthless methods, the US government has historically partnered with brutal authoritarian regimes in order to achieve their short-term goals, with, of course, significant costs imposed upon a range of people around the globe. In general, in order to accomplish their ends, those that operate empire will need to be willing to employ any and all means under the belief that the ends justify the means. I have two more aspects of the interventionist mindset. Fourth aspect of the interventionist mindset is a lack of self-awareness. Interveners tend to be completely unaware of their own limitations and the possibility that they can fail or that their plans will be rejected. When interventionists are met with rejection or failure, they tend to blame the people they are intervening upon. Two examples. During a 2005 speech, then President George W. Bush, 2005, yeah. George W. Bush stated that, quote, "We gave the Afghan people a chance to live in a free and democratic society," end quote. Almost a decade later, in 2014, then President Barack Obama stated, quote, "We gave Iraq the chance to have an inclusive democracy," end quote. The implication of these statements is that the citizens of Afghanistan and Iraq should be grateful for the U.S. government for bestowing these gifts that were delivered by military invasion and occupation. The attitude also suggests that the failure of interventions has nothing to do with the intervening government. It is rather entirely the fault of the foreign populations for failing to take advantage of the opportunities that have been gifted to them. Finally, a strong conviction that order is the result of state imposition on the grandest of possible scales. Absent government control and planning, interventionists see disorder and chaos in the world. Moreover, it's not just control by any government that's required for order, but the right government, which conveniently is always the government of the interventionist. This mentality has a long history in the US, which can be traced back to 1904, at least 1904, when President Theodore Roosevelt laid out the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which of course expanded the US government's policing powers in the Western Hemisphere. Through time, that the range or broadcasting those police powers have expanded throughout the globe. Why is this problematic? For a variety of reasons, but the one I want to highlight is it neglects the long tradition of spontaneous order thinkers, who, among other things, have emphasized that crucial and significant parts of the world are not the result of human design, but rather the result of emergence, and that attempts to design and impose those institutions are not going to lead to order and harmony, but chaos, the very chaos that interveners purport to fix. Overall, the interventionist mindset, those 5 characteristics, are at odds with liberal principles. Liberal principles, or the liberal philosophy, of course, is complex and has a long history. But if I had to identify some common features of that philosophy, I would identify things like the primacy of individual freedom, a deep respect for both human dignity and intellectual humility, an appreciation for voluntary choice and association, toleration and appreciation for spontaneous orders, and a commitment to peaceful solutions to interpersonal conflict. That interventionist mindset is at odds with those fundamental principles. The Harvard historian Caroline Elkins released a book about 2 years ago now called Legacy of Violence, and it was about the British Empire. And I want to read you a quote from it because she talks in there about the illiberalism of the supposedly liberal British Empire. This is Elkins writing. Quote, "If Britain's civilizing mission was reformist in its claims, it was brutal nonetheless. Violence was not just the British Empire's midwife, it was endemic to the structures and systems of British rule. It was not just an occasional means of liberal imperialism's ends, it was the means and the end for as long as the British Empire remained alive." A number of scholars, such as political scientist Patrick Porter, have made similar arguments about the supposed US liberal empire. The main takeaway being that liberal empires are not very liberal in practice. Finally, we have the constitutional challenge. The main purpose of the night watchman state is to uphold the rights and liberties of citizens. The state's military activities are seen by its proponents as fulfilling this duty. The challenge is that in exercising these powers, the state can, and typically does, violates the very rights it purports to protect. F.A. Hayek was well aware of these tensions in the third volume of Law, Legislation, and Liberty when he wrote, quote, "Emergencies have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of individual liberty have been eroded. And once they are suspended, it is not difficult for anyone who has assumed such emergency powers to see to it that the emergency will persist." Now, it's often argued that governments need discretion to act efficiently in top-down planning for the global good and to address domestic and global emergencies. The issue is that this can and does lead to permanent expansions in state power. Typically, those movements are towards authoritarian police state characteristics, as documented by the economic historian Robert Higgs in his work on the ratchet effect and growth of government. It's also important to remember that the political elite are not simply passive actors who observe crises and then respond to them. They proactively look to expand their powers in the name of addressing emergencies, many of which they play a role in creating. And they look to expand their powers in order to foster their own self-importance and to broadcast their influence domestically and internationally. It's for this very reason that a range of thinkers across the ideological spectrum have emphasized that war is among the greatest limits to state power. Here's the tension. Expansions in state power, even if we assume that they're initially driven by benevolent intentions, they're not a switch. You can't just flip them on and off in a neutral manner. Instead, the scale and scope of government, increases in the scale and scope of government have long-lasting effects on the social, on the legal, on the economic, and on the political fabric of domestic life that can't easily be undone, if at all. So where does this leave us? Well, I want to kind of sum up where we are now in two images. On the one hand, we have liberal empire that is grounded in the Samuelsonian logic. Now, our very own Mike Munger likes to invoke the imagery of a unicorn. He likes to do that in order to capture the assumption that government will do what its proponents want it to do. So Mike writes, quote, proponents of state intervention, quote, want a kind of unicorn, a state that has the properties, motivations, knowledge, and abilities they can imagine for it, end quote. Having known Mike now for 20 years and having been inspired with him, I would like to introduce you to Rambo Corn. Rambo Corn effortlessly maximizes global social welfare. He maximizes liberal values that are powered through his rainbow weapons. Something akin to Rambo Corn is what people seem to imagine when they discuss the necessity of state provision of empire and the state provision of defense, and dismiss those that question those assumptions as being naive and ideological. The implicit belief is that government is going to do what proponents of empire want it to do, and that alternatives are not worthy of consideration, because, as faithful Samuelsonians, provision via spontaneous decentralized forces is assumed away from the start. The 5 challenges that I just discussed suggest that this might not be an accurate representation of real-world governments and real-world empire. So let's think about a contrasting vision. The contrasting vision is one provided by the Spanish artist Francisco Goya. In the 19th century, he put forth a piece of art titled Saturn Devouring His Sun. For my purposes, this image represents the Leviathan. That Leviathan is tasked with bringing order to the world through top-down force, brute force when it's required. Here, improvements in social welfare are judged by those that control the Leviathan. In the process of imposing order, Leviathan devours liberalism while purporting to advance liberal principles. This image, the one on your left, captures the point that was made by Kenneth Boulding in a paper titled Pathologies of Defense, which was published in 1984. This is Kenneth Boulding speaking. There is only one conflict that makes any difference to the future. This is the conflict between the human race itself and its national defense organizations, which threaten to destroy it. Under these circumstances, an economic approach to national defense, a little more of this, a little less of that, some concentration of defense weapons, arms control, a little balance here, a little imbalance there, can only be described as trash. It is wholly irrelevant to the future of the human race. Any realistic appraisal of the world situation would come to the conclusion that the national state, no matter what it is or how virtuous it is, should not be defended because its defense can only lead to the destruction of us all, end quote. Boulding's argument was that we now lived in a world where nation states provide defense in name only. Defense now means offense that imposes significant costs on innocent human beings both at home and abroad. Moreover, governments possess weapons of mass destruction that threaten the very existence of the people they purport to protect. As Boulding noted, escaping this situation isn't a matter of making marginal changes to the status quo, but thinking about wholesale changes to the way we understand peace and security. Now, I can understand why many people might find Boulding's sentiments and rhetoric overly strong. But nonetheless, even if you do, he offers us an invitation to consider alternative views to peace that move away from the dominant nation-centric, empire-centric, strength through military might view that seems to dominate today. This sets the stage for the science of peace. That science of peace, I would contend, in economics, can be traced back to at least Adam Smith. This, of course, is a well-known quote from Smith that was recorded during his lectures prior to the publications of The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. Here, Smith points out that peace is central to social cooperation. Now, of course, many people invoke this quote and read it as Smith delineating the foundational roles of the state and the role of the state in society. But what I want to suggest is that this is too narrow of a reading and too state-centric. To understand why, let me offer a sixth challenge, what I call the human creativity challenge. And I just want to briefly show you a couple quotes from some thinkers in the I'll call it the liberal tradition, or the mainline tradition. In The Constitution of Liberty, F.A. Hayek, Chapter 2, he titled the chapter, The Creative Powers of Free Civilization, or Free Society, pardon me. Why? For Hayek, it is the creativity of the every person that leads to advances in human civilization. James Buchanan and Victor Vanberg pointed out that it is human choice by ordinary people and their creativity which drives markets. Not markets in the raw, but the creative and innovative aspects of markets. Julian Simon pointed out that every single day of his life, he relies on low IQ people to do things for him in a way that could harm him. He also points out that there are numerous cases throughout history whereby supposedly high IQ people designed and implemented policies that have wrought massive destruction and reductions in human well-being. Finally, Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom pointed out that social scientists, who typically are among those high IQ people, tend to ignore the creativity of the every person, the entrepreneurial capabilities of the every person. What all of these scholars emphasized was that ordinary people possess the significant scope to improve the world in which they live. They are not helpless pawns that are stuck in a situation where they can't fix problems. That doesn't mean they're always going to fix problems, but there's that possibility. This point about human creativity is at the foundation of what I call the science of peace. So let me consider two views of society. Let me sum this up for you. One is what I'll call the standard view. This is how most people frame these issues based on the Samuelsonian provision of public goods, which is required by the state. In order to get extraordinary outcomes, economic growth, liberal outcomes, peace, we need extraordinary people. Only the extraordinary amongst us can bring about extraordinary outcomes. But in order to do that, we need to give them extraordinary powers over us in order to implement and design their vision. This framing is one of vertical relationships. The elite rule over ordinary people who are framed, modeled as inferior. An alternative view goes something like this. Ordinary people, if given space, can come up with extraordinary outcomes. What are those outcomes? I don't know, because they are not the result of predetermination and planning as in the standard view. They emerge out of human interactions. So, what I'd like to talk about as I head towards the home stretch here is the science of peace. The science of peace, to my way of thinking, is the systematic study of the ability of people to navigate a variety of conflict challenges they face. I don't want to presume that they always will do that. I also don't want to presume, as Samuelson did, that it's impossible for them to do that. That is the study of peace. So, to my way of thinking, we shouldn't rule out ex ante that coercion through Leviathan might be the only way we can bring about peace in the world. But I also don't want to assume that that outcome is a fait accompli, that it has to be that way. Because this alternative view recognizes that sharpening the teeth of the state in order to combat coercion might do just the opposite, by elevating coercion as the primary instrument for governing human relations. So let me say a few words about the science of peace as I come to a close. First, peace is possible. Kenneth Boulding, in his book The Stable Peace, put forth what he called Boulding's first law. Boulding's first law is that if something exists, it must be possible. We observe peace between ordinary people. If you think about in your daily life, we take it for granted how many peaceful interactions you have with other strangers from the moment you wake up to the time you go to bed, when you travel in foreign lands, starting with when you leave your house and travel into the foreign lands of North Carolina, when you venture across borders. Is there always peaceful interactions? No. Are there often? Yes. That means peace is possible. Doesn't mean it always exists, but it's possible. That's step one. The second is methodological individualism. The science of peace doesn't deny that there are collective organizations. Nation states exist. International organizations exist. But guess what? People exist too. One of the big issues with talking about things like there's a major conflict or tensions between the US and China, as our political leaders do, is it neglects the fact that there are approximately, if I'm correct in my math, about 1.7 billion human beings that reside in the geographic spaces we call China and we call America. And those people are neglected when we aggregate up and fall prey to the raw collectivism of referring to human beings as if they are part of a whole. It also neglects that these people, again, 1.7 billion people, are all part of numerous overlapping, diverse, and unique peace systems in their own lives. Third, peace is not some single homogeneous state. Again, that's how we tend to conceptualize it. We talk about peace as if it exists or if it doesn't exist. But what if we follow the sociologist Elise Boulding in recognizing that the actual world, both in our own lives, domestically, internationally, are characterized by cultures of peace. Numerous different skills, institutions, both formal and informal, which allow us to navigate conflict situations. And they're highly diverse. Again, you wake up, your roommate or your significant other or whomever you live with, you both go reach for the coffee pot at the same time. We have a conflict situation. How are we going to fix it? There's numerous ways to fix it. One is you can say, please go first. You can turn take. You can have a fist fight. Most of us don't have fist fights. Why is that? Because we've figured out ways to navigate it. Then we go to work and there's conflict situations and we have to navigate those. And these are all different forms and manifestations, and they're all context specific. Even if you look at the most violent societies where violence is occurring, there are many pockets of peace throughout that are typically taken for granted. People are cooperating, even if at a local level, while violence is happening around them. Understanding that is part of the science of peace. Next, peace is a process. People tend to talk about peace as if it's an end state. We need to do this to get peace, as if it's a final state of rest. But what if we view peace as a process? Something from when we're the youngest of age. What's one of the things that we tend to teach kids? Don't hit, don't take other people's stuff. That's teaching them about nonviolent means of social interaction. And then as we make our way through life, we have to cultivate those skills. We need to learn because we're in different settings. We're in different contexts. And so viewing peace as a process is a very different framing than someone has to design peace and we need the state to do it. Finally, the role of ideas in institutions. What people believe, what Kenneth Boulding calls people's image, the vision they have, is important for peace because it allows us to envision or not envision certain states of affairs. Think about this. If ordinary people don't believe they can bring about peace, so if people are raised to believe that only governments can bring about peace, then they're going to tend to think only governments can bring about peace. They're not going to be able to envision alternatives to that. What is the problem with that? Well, among other things, people will tend to, as the Nobel laureate James Buchanan put it, be afraid to be free. They'll be afraid to be free because they will have a framing that they're incapable of engaging in self-governance, at least on certain margins, and that they must rely on their state overlords to bring them peace, liberty, and well-being. So in closing, let me say a few words about visions. And I touched upon this already with Boulding's The Image. In his 1949 paper, The Intellectuals and Socialism, Hayek has this quote. I won't read it to you. You can look at it yourself. But what Hayek called for is a radical liberal vision. And he said that radical liberal vision might be utopian today, but it's a goal that we want to work towards. So this idea of visions. Visions matter. I already mentioned Boulding. Who else? The economist Joseph Schumpeter. In his book, History of Economic Analysis, which was published in 1954, Schumpeter emphasized the role of visions. Visions are pre-analytic cognitive acts. They provide us with the raw material that allows us to engage in analysis because they help us as thinkers, whether as social scientists or just people operating in the world, about how we view the world, what type of questions we ask, what framing those questions what framing those questions take. The challenge that Hayek poses here in this one paragraph, it's an enormous one. We need intellectuals, he argues. And I would argue this goes beyond intellectuals. We need people. It doesn't just have to be people in academics, but people who can envision a different state of a free society. For many people, nation states and empires are the only institutional arrangements they can envision for organizing large-scale, complex organizations. If we take Hayek seriously, the challenge is to think about alternatives. Whether those alternatives are feasible or not has nothing to do with it in the Hayekian context, because we can potentially envision a better state of the world than one that exists today. This is hard. It's hard because many people see nation states and empires and militarism as a more legitimate and serious response to the challenges in the world, because they see those things as offering certainty, and they view alternatives as offering a chaos, as being soft, as being naive, as being wishful. But when you think about it, militarism and empire offer no certainty. They offer no guarantee of peace. They offer no guarantee of individual freedom and liberty. In fact, they might produce the very opposite. What I want to conclude with is that the science of peace is both useful for analyzing real-world arrangements that we tend to overlook in the world, but also for imagining and envisioning alternatives. To my way of thinking, if liberals are unwilling to push the boundaries of their project, number one, they're going to fall prey to the type of critiques which I think are accurate that I raised earlier, the one raised by Cornel West. But I also want to argue that they're going to miss key opportunities to pursue what I take to be our shared pursuit of human liberation, human freedom, and human flourishing. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
We have time for questions. We can take them. Can I start with one?
Mm-hmm.
So you invoked Adam Smith and the idea of justice, easy taxes, and peace. But he was also someone who called for a standing army. And so, and I think the reasoning was that, okay, peace is good, but you have to have some ability to protect. You're providing justice not only domestically, but also against foreign elements. So how does that fit into your liberal vision?
Yeah, I think in a couple ways. One is that Smith called for standing armies, but he also was a critic, pardon me, of colonization. And so there are potential tensions that remain unresolved here, which is, can you maintain a standing army but not engage in colonization? To the extent you can, perhaps there's no tension at all, which is if the part of the standing army is to defend, however you define that, then it necessarily limits the outward scope of the use of that military force, in which case we don't have to worry about that, in empire I mean. The challenge though is not to assume that, but to think about arrangements that can prevent that, assuming you think it's something that is important to prevent. I do think that even if people who believe in an outward projection of force still argue that there need to be constraints on that force. And so the challenge falls on them to demonstrate those things. And so that's how I tend to think about it. It's the same way I think about the kind of tensions that exist with Hayek and with Buchanan, which is both of them recognized a role for government, what Buchanan called the protective, productive state, what others have called the limiter or night watchman state. And they emphasized the importance of constitutions, but they never really wrestled with the way that you could deal with, on the one hand, Hayek's argument that emergencies are the reason why you get erosions in constitutional constraint and the need for those things. Hayek dabbles in this, as you know, in the last chapter of Individualism and Economic Order, and I think it's chapter 15 of The Road to Serfdom, the second to last chapter. He talks about international federations. And really his vision, he doesn't really have it laid out in detail, but he seems to have some vision where you take a federalist system and move it to the international level. Now, interestingly, in the Montpellerin transcripts that you put out recently, I guess a couple of years now, there's 2 sessions, if I remember, on this idea of international federation at the original Montpellerin Society. And there, again, these are transcripts of people speaking, so they're not well-developed thoughts in a smooth way we would think about it in an academic setting. Hayek seems a lot more skeptical, at least in these few lines we have him speaking about the feasibility of these things, because the concern is 1 or 2 states are going to tend to dominate the federation and undermine it. And so that's how I tend to think about it. I think the science of peace doesn't rule out the need or the possibility of force, although I think there's oftentimes many non-violent means of resolving conflict situations where people oftentimes jump to the need to force automatically. And I don't think we should do that. But I also can't rule out the possibility that some kind of standing army is both necessary and desirable. Steve?
Yeah, I feel like I don't know if you're playing 2 sides here. I'll just say, I think you're subject to the same criticism you were levying against the authoritarians.
Why is that?
That is, that they too can do the utopian and a planner can make everything work just right. Okay? In reality, not so much, right? Then the flip side, what you're talking about, we can envision a world, but Putin. Yep. That is, they're ignoring knowledge problems and all the other public choicey stuff, and I feel like yours ignores the reality of bad actors in the world that we can't get around. Now, maybe you're not talking about that. That's part of it. Is I don't know what you're talking about. Are you talking about national defense as a whole, and stopping bad actors like Putin or Hitler or whoever? Or are you simply talking about replacing tin pot dictators with our own tin pot dictators to bring liberalism to the world? Those are sort of 2 different things, I think.
I think they're embedded in the same. So to answer your question, I'm talking about all of the above. And let me respond why I don't think I'm subject to the same criticism, even though your point is well taken. First of all, I fully recognize that there are bad actors in the world. That, in some sense, that's at the heart of the critique of empire, which is that there are power-hungry, vainglorious, obnoxious, terrible people in the world, which to my way of thinking is a reason to be quite skeptical of giving them power in the first place, even if the goal is to stop other terrible people. But that then leaves open your point, which I took to be the root of your point, which is, are these bad people? So even if we want to avoid that in our little sphere, what are we going to do about the people out there? And that's the open question. That's part of what I take to be the science of peace. The reason I think that perhaps your framing is the way it is because I haven't offered a concrete answer. And I haven't done so purposefully. The reason I haven't done so is I don't think there is one that can be offered. And in fact, the critique of the Samuelsonian, what I've been calling the standard view, is the certainty of a single critique, both in national defense and in the type of things you're talking about. It is inherently an unscientific approach because that approach rules out an entire class of phenomena ex ante. It rules out the class of phenomena whereby individuals can potentially resolve collective action problems at all different levels. And so, to restate, the way I'm laying out the science of peace and it is not to say this is how the world should look, is not to say we should impose some vision on the world. It is that our task as social scientists, forget about the liberalism part, our task as social scientists is to study the wide array of arrangements that exist and can exist and focus on the realities of those things. And comparative institutional analysis allows us to help us understand those things. Then we can also bring in normative components. That's where the liberal component comes in. Now, how do those things relate? Here's how I think they relate. Normative things are nice, but we need some way of analyzing the feasibility of them. Otherwise, anyone can say anything they like, as you put it quite nicely. That's where the positive aspect comes in, which is that we can use the tools of what I'll call political economy to analyze, granted in very broad pattern, broad strokes, how different institutional arrangements both operate in the here and now but might exist to help us understand the world, to help us understand the strengths and weaknesses, the robustness and fragility of those things. And that's ultimately the best we have. And so I'm able to insulate myself from that critique because I don't have to answer that question. The people that have to answer the question are the people with certainty that they can fix the world's problems. Person, yeah, right there behind Steve.
I would like to hear more about, and maybe it's a related question to the previous one, about how you scale up your science of peace. Because all the examples that you gave us are based on, when you were saying like, we solve or we avoid conflicts every day, but I think it's a completely different context,
Yeah.
because you have repeated interactions, you have a reputation, and you have all these kind of things, and you have very clear punishments. And but how do you scale up at the national and international level?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, in many of our interactions, we don't have those things. We don't have repeated dealings. We don't have reputation effects. Some of them we do. Many of the strangers we interact with, we have none of those things at all. And those things don't necessarily relate to violence. But that's an excellent question you raise. And of course, here's the challenge we face. To the same extent I have to respond to that challenge, so do the proponents of national and international organizations, because they purport that those organizations represent the interests of the people they typically represent, and they typically invoke, at least rhetorically, the language of democracy in doing it. And what that requires of them is some kind of demonstration that those organizations are reflecting some kind of aggregation of the preferences of the people they represent. Notice what this means. Two things. Number one, it's ultimately all based in individuals at the lowest level. So you can never get away from that to the extent you want to make the argument that these organizations are representing the interests of individuals. Now, one way around that is to say, I don't care about the interests of individuals. We'll just get some people. They will have kind of the veneer of democracy, but really they're going to pick what goes. And that's, as far as it goes, good or bad, depending on where you come down, but you have to give up that language. If you subscribe to that, then notice what it means. If you subscribe to the democracy view, it means people can engage in collective action problems and scale up. That's what it necessarily has to mean. That's all I'm saying. And so from the standpoint, we have a situation where you either have democratic institutions that are doing what democratic institutions are supposed to do, or we don't. And if we don't, then let's give that up. If we do, then let's appreciate what the implications of that are and the beauty and radicalness of those implications, rather than shutting those things off. And to the extent they're not, and you find those democratic type norms normatively appealing, to my way of thinking, that's a reason to be skeptical if outright against organizations which undermine and are not subject to those democratic norms and processes. But that is in the eye of the beholder. And so that's how I would think about it. Yes, one more? Yes, please.
A couple of things. The first thing that struck me is, I hope you're not saying that all cultures are equally valid or good. Or
All what are equally?
cultures.
Oh, cultures?
All cultures are equal. That's a subsidiary point. My main point is really a parochial one. I want to defend the British Empire. Because you cited this book by this lady Elkins.
Yep.
Have you read a complimentary one by Nigel Degar,
I have not.
which is called The Moral
Yep.
Case for Empire? And so, I mean, her statement about mass violence and so on is absolute nonsense. India, for example, was governed by the Brits for a long time.
Yep.
Do you know how many Brits were in India at those times?
I don't know.
100,000. Do you know how many Indians were there? 500 million, maybe? It would be hard to argue that they did it by military force. The other point I want to make is that, at least the British Empire, which I have some acquaintance with, it cost the Brits a lot of money. They weren't making money out of all of it. In Africa, for example, they had charitable things. I worked for 2 years ago, in an African country for something called the Health and Nutrition Scheme, okay? It dealt with kids, African kids. It was trying to treat diseases suffered only by the Africans, not by the Europeans, only by the Africans. The Africans appeared voluntarily, right? They weren't coerced. So it's an absurdity to quote this lady on the horrors of the British Empire. And I'd suggest you look at some other Harvard historians who are equally bad in their pictures of it. So that's just a factual point. There are a lot of other points we could talk about, but that factual point.
Sure. Well, very quickly to respond, big issues. Number one, are all cultures equal? It depends on what your normative benchmark is. So that's a whole point for discussion. Second of all, it's equally incorrect, I think absurd was the word you used, to argue that that empires throughout history have somehow resolved on peaceful kumbaya to get their way. That's not true. Now we can debate the scale of violence. You can debate in various contexts what was involved in it. But the idea that they were there and they said, "Hey, do you want this?" and everyone peacefully just fell in the line, certainly goes in the face of colonization, of interventionism throughout history.
But I would add one point. You at least have to look at the level of violence in a country before it was colonized, after it was colonized, and after it was decolonized. And I think what you'll find is that the level of violence during the colonization period is probably lower than the other two.
Maybe, perhaps. That's an empirical question. The other point you raised was, hold on. The other point you raised about the Brits paying a lot. I think that's fundamentally the point. That was Smith's point, by the way, in his critique of empire, which is these things cost a lot. So then why are they doing it? Out of their benevolent spirit for the common good of the world? I don't think so. That's certainly one take. And if so, that's wonderful. It's very nice to have benevolent people wielding the levers of power. We should apply that symmetrically to across cases, not cherry pick, as you nicely pointed out. I think what probably happened is there were interest groups that were benefiting from colonization, and they were pushing off the costs on other people to foot the bill. Very much like the U.S. occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, which cost a significant amount of money, which was mostly paid for by the issuance of debt. And whether, again, that was beneficial or not, I will leave to others to decide. I have my own views on that. But that's the challenge, and that is the burden. That's the burden, is for proponents of that position to lay out not just the point about violence. And by the way, even if it's true that you find a historical case of violence, just like your humanitarian issue, you're helping people. Of course, if government does stuff on a big enough scale, benefits are going to emerge. All right? So this isn't an argument about, I'm not saying every single instance of this is bad. It's a pattern prediction. All right? I live in Northern Virginia, Fairfax, one of the wealthiest counties in the entire country. The school system, one of the best in the country. Drive 45 minutes into Washington, D.C. or Baltimore, some of the worst school systems in the entire country. Is the U.S. school system good or bad? That's the wrong question to ask. If you look at Robinson High School around the corner from me, greatest thing ever. If you look in Baltimore or D.C., worst thing ever. It's pattern predictions. It's context specific. So for every instance of someone pointing out, we gave a Band-Aid and wheat to people that were hungry, you can point out cases where actions led to violence, starvation, and a whole host of other issues. And so then we're forced into a situation of what Hayek called pattern predictions, looking at the broad context, being able to make broad predictions, but recognizing that as social scientists, we're limited in making specific predictions. And whether that is a blessing or a curse, I'll leave up to each of you. Where Hayek left, to close this up, where my reading of Hayek left us is that's just the best we can do. And it's one input of many into understanding the complexities of the world, and it's an important one. So thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity.